Hey folks, Mr. Howard here for chapter 19 of The Picture of Dorian Gray. I may just go ahead and read chapter 20 after that today too. You're pretty close to the end of the book. Last chapter we had Dorian at Selby Royale, his country estate, hanging out with the Duchess, whom he was having an affair with, and Lord Henry. He sees James Vane, and then James Vane gets serendipitously, or, in terms of good luck, shot by the Duchess's brother in a shooting accident, a hunting accident. And James is dead, and so Dorian is free from, theoretically, the poetic justice that was coming for him for driving Sybil to suicide. Which brings us to chapter 19, the second to last chapter. It's going to start out back in the city with Lord Henry, of course, still talking to Dorian. It's a really important thematic chapter. A lot of things we talked about early on start to really coalesce as Oscar Wilde gets ready to conclude the story. And it really is a pretty satisfying conclusion in a lot of ways. So chapter 19. "There's no use you telling me that you're going to be good," cried Lord Henry, dipping his white fingers into a red copper bowl filled with rose water. "You are quite perfect. Pray don't change." So Dorian Gray has made a resolution, apparently, to be good, and he's talking to Lord Henry about it. Of course he's talking to Lord Henry about it. And Lord Henry, if you recall, talked about resolutions early on in the story. He suggested that resolutions are checks people draw on a bank in which they have no account, that they never turn into anything, and that people shouldn't bother to make them, that they're sort of a weakness of the soul or something like that. And here's Dorian apparently tired of being evil and making a resolution to change, to be good. This, of course, after he's driven Sybil to suicide, after he's murdered Basil, and after James has died in an attempt to gain vengeance. So maybe Dorian's finally feeling the guilt that he's put off by viewing his life as a spectator, by taking Lord Henry's advice and living a hedonistic life, searching for pleasure rather than happiness, and that they're two separate things, and he's discovered this in some of the previous chapters. Dorian Gray shook his head. "No, Harry, I have done too many dreadful things in my life. I am not going to do any more. I began my good actions yesterday." "Where were you yesterday?" "In the country, Harry. I was staying at a little inn by myself." "My dear boy," said Lord Henry, smiling, "anybody can be good in the country. There are no temptations there. That is the reason why people who live out of town are so absolutely uncivilized. Civilization is not by any means an easy thing to attain to. There are only two ways by which men can reach it. One is by being cultured, and the other by being corrupt. In the country, people have no opportunity of being either, so they stagnate." Really interesting observations. Civilization and corruption seem to be twined in Lord Henry's mind. There are only two ways to be civilized. One is to be cultured and the other is to be corrupt. Maybe these two things are related. Maybe there's a link between culture and corruption. This idea that it kind of goes back to Rousseau. You want to go back to your great thinkers, Rousseau and his idea of the noble savage, that people who live in primitive societies, tribal societies, are inherently good because they haven't been corrupted by the evil of society. Lord Henry's philosophy sort of dovetails with that romantic Rousseau sort of thinking, which I think is intriguing when you consider that he's sort of the representation of realism in the story. And Rousseau is definitely a heavily romantic period thinker. So I think that's worth looking at. Also, this idea that there are no temptations in the country, and so like anybody can be good in the country. So being good in the country is meaningless. It only matters if you're good when you are good and you have a choice to be bad. If there's no choice to be bad, if there's no option to be evil, then does the goodness even matter? Does it even count? Which seems to make you wonder about the ideas like free will and things like that. And we'll consider that as we continue to read on. "Culture and corruption," echoed Dorian. "I have known something of both. It seems terrible to me now that they should ever be found together. For I have a new ideal, Harry. I am going to alter. I think I have altered." "You have not yet told me what your good action was. Or did you say you had done more than one?" asked his companion, as he split into his plate a little crimson pyramid of seeded strawberries, and through a perforated shell-shaped spoon snowed white sugar upon them. Can you imagine how much effort it must be for his servants to take every seed out of his strawberries? I can tell you, Harry, it is not a story I could tell to anyone else. I spared somebody. It sounds vain, but you understand what I mean. She was quite beautiful and wonderfully like Sybil Vane. I think it was that which first attracted me to her. You remember Sybil, don't you? How long ago that seems. Well, Hetty was not one of our own class, of course. She was simply a girl in a village, but I really loved her. I am quite sure that I loved her. All during this wonderful May that we have been having, I used to run down and see her 2 or 3 times a week. Yesterday, she met me in a little orchard. The apple blossoms kept tumbling down on her hair, and she was laughing. We were to have gone away together this morning at dawn. Suddenly, I determined to leave her as flower-like as I had found her. Pause. So there's a lot of symbolism and allegory and allusion going on here. So Dorian has found this girl that's very much like Sybil Vane, and he has spared her. And he says it sounds vain that he spared her. But look at the scene. Like, she's an innocent young girl like Sybil used to be. They met in an orchard. Apple orchard with blossoms falling all over the place, flower imagery, goes back to the Romeo and Juliet scene. Like, the connections between her and Sybil here are pretty strong, and the connections between what's going on here and the idea of original sin and the Garden of Eden and apples, and that's strong too. But Dorian intends to leave her and thereby save her from falling into sin, and that's his great act of goodness. It's all thematically important. I should think the novelty of the emotion must have given you a thrill of real pleasure, Dorian, interrupted Lord Henry. But I can finish your idyll for you. You gave her good advice, and you broke her heart. That was the beginning of your reformation. So Lord Henry's pretty cynical. He's like, yeah, congratulations. I'm sure that it was enjoyable to you to break this girl's heart because it was a new emotion for you, and we're always searching for new sensations. And your good advice was just making her sad. Good job. Harry, you are horrible. You mustn't say these dreadful things. Hetty's heart is not broken. Of course, she cried and all that. But there is no disgrace upon her. She could live like Perdita in her garden of mint and marigold. And weep over a faithless Florizel, said Lord Henry. That's an allusion to Twelfth Night. No, I lied. A Winter's Tale. Shakespeare play. So again, lots of Shakespeare allusions sort of coming in here. There's going to be more coming in. And these are connections to Sybil Vane and what was going on. And weep over a faithless Florizel, said Lord Henry, laughing as he leaned back in his chair. My dear Dorian, you have the most curiously boyish moods. Do you think this girl will ever be really contented now with any of her own rank? I suppose she will be married some day to a rough carter or a grinning ploughman. Well, the fact of having met you and loved you will teach her to despise her husband. And she will be wretched. From a moral point of view, I cannot say that I think much of your great renunciation. Even as a beginning, it is poor. Besides, how do you know that Hetty isn't floating at the present moment in some starlit mill pond with lovely water lilies round her like Ophelia? That's, of course, a Hamlet reference. How do you know she hasn't committed suicide like Sybil? Another connection. I can't bear this, Harry. You mock at everything and then suggest the most serious tragedies. I am sorry I told you now. I don't care what you say to me. I know I was right in acting as I did. Poor Hetty. As I rode past the farm this morning, I saw her white face at the window like a spray of jasmine. Don't let me talk about it anymore. And don't try to persuade me that the first good action I have done for years, the first little bit of self-sacrifice I have ever known, is really a sort of sin. That's an interesting line, too. His self-sacrifice is a sin. Why did he do it? What is Dorian playing at here? Is it really that he's trying to be good, or is there something more to it? I want to be better. I am going to be better. Tell me something about yourself. What is going on in town? I have not been to the club for days. The people are still discussing poor Basil's disappearance. I should have thought they had got tired of that by this time, said Dorian, pouring himself out some wine and frowning slightly. My dear boy, they have only been talking about it for 6 weeks, and the British public are really not equal to the mental strain of having more than one topic every 3 months. They have been very fortunate lately, however. They have had my own divorce case and Alan Campbell's suicide. Now they have got the mysterious disappearance of an artist. pause. Okay, Lord Henry's getting divorced. I suppose that was inevitable. He treats women terribly and doesn't seem to care about them at all. So that's not a surprise to me. Alan Campbell's suicide. You remember Alan Campbell. He destroyed the body. Is this another suicide to be laid at Dorian Gray's feet? Yeah, I think clearly it is. And then Basil's disappearance. I wonder if Dorian has to do with all three of those. How many pictures of Dorian did Lord Henry have in his house back in chapter, 5 or whatever it was? 17? Why did his wife leave him? Just saying. So maybe all three of these things are to be laid at Dorian's feet. Scotland Yard still insists that the man in the grey ulster who left for Paris by the midnight train on the 9th of November was poor Basil. And the French police declare that Basil never arrived in Paris at all. I suppose in about a fortnight we shall be told that he has been seen in San Francisco. It is an odd thing, but everyone who disappears is said to be seen in San Francisco. It must be a delightful city and possess all the attraction of the next world. What do you think has happened to Basil? Asked Dorian, holding up his burgundy against the light and wondering how it was that he could discuss the matter so calmly. I have not the slightest idea. If Basil chooses to hide himself, it is no business of mine. If he is dead, I don't want to think about him. Death is the only thing that ever terrifies me. I hate it. Why? Said the younger man wearily. Because, said Lord Henry, passing beneath his nostrils the gilt trellis of an open vinaigrette box, one can survive everything nowadays except that. Death and vulgarity are the only two facts in the 19th century that one cannot explain away. Let us have our coffee in the music room, Dorian. You must play me some Chopin. The man with whom my wife ran away played Chopin exquisitely. Poor Victoria. I was very fond of her. The house is rather lonely without her. Of course, married life is merely a habit, a bad habit. But then one regrets the loss of even one's worst habits. Perhaps one regrets them the most. They are such an essential part of one's personality. So he's still talking badly about marriage. I think it's interesting that his wife ran away with the pianist. Like, that goes right back to the chapter we had earlier. It seems to have been foreshadowed effectively. Dorian said nothing, but rose from the table and passing into the next room, sat down at the piano and let his fingers stray across the white and black ivory of the keys. I think it's interesting we have Dorian Gray here playing black and white keys. We have some nice color symbolism coming to fruition in this last chapter. Also, piano's an art form, and Dorian Gray's life has been art, so we get that art thing going on as well. After the coffee had been brought in, he stopped and looked over at Lord Henry and said, Harry, did it ever occur to you that Basil was murdered? Lord Henry yawned. And Basil was very popular and always wore a Waterbury watch. Why should he have been murdered? He was not clever enough to have enemies. Of course, he had a wonderful genius for painting, but a man can paint like Velázquez and yet be as dull as possible. Basil was really rather dull. He only interested me once, and that was when he told me years ago that he had a wild adoration for you, and that you were the dominant motive in his art. I was very fond of Basil, said Dorian with a note of sadness in his voice. But don't people say that he was murdered? What is Dorian getting at here? Oh, some of the papers do. It does not seem to me to be at all probable. I know there are dreadful places in Paris, but Basil was not the sort of man to have gone to them. He had no curiosity. It was his chief defect. That's, going back to the Garden of Eden, too. If Basil's a god figure, he outlaws the apple. Why did they eat the apple? Curiosity. He expected them not to have any because he had none himself. I mean, if you know everything, you don't need to be curious about anything. What would you say, Harry, if I told you that I had murdered Basil? Said the younger man. He watched him intently after he had spoken. Another spectator of your own life moment? But what's he playing at? Why is he trying to confess here to Lord Henry in some weird sort of way? I would say, my dear fellow, that you are posing for a character that doesn't suit you. All crime is vulgar, just as all vulgarity is crime. It is not in you, Dorian, to commit a murder. I am sorry if I hurt your vanity by saying so, but I assure you it is true. Crime belongs exclusively to the lower orders. I don't blame them in the smallest degree. I should fancy that crime was to them what art is to us, simply a method of procuring extraordinary sensations. Hold up, is this a connection to Hetty? The idea that Dorian spared her as a way of procuring a new sensation, self-denial being that sensation? Is Oscar Wilde making a connection here? A method of procuring sensations. Do you think that a man who has once committed a murder could possibly do the same crime again? Don't tell me that. Oh, anything becomes a pleasure if one does it too often, cried Lord Henry, laughing. That is one of the most important secrets of life. I should fancy, however, that murder is always a mistake.